Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to talk today, and I will try to finish within half an hour, I hope. So I will be talking about risk management of Natick hazards in urban areas, and I will, I guess, make the case for the need for a paradigm shift in industrial risk management. I will try to speak slowly. So let's see. This is the outline of the presentation. First, I will ask the question, is there a problem? I think after Aoki Sensei's presentation and Ishimaru Sensei's presentation, we can agree that there is a problem. Then I will briefly explain the difference between chemical and Natick accidents. Then we'll talk a little bit about the incidents and consequences of these kinds of events. Then what are the implications for risk communication, evacuation planning, emergency response when we learn from past accidents. Then discuss the need for a paradigm shift and then some conclusions, okay? So first, the question is there a problem? I think from the discussion, the presentation from Aoki Sensei and Ishimaru Sensei, we can agree that currently there is a high risk of Natick accidents, in particularly around the industrial complexes, the Kombinato, in Osaka Bay, probably in Tokyo Bay. And when you look at this image, this is a photo I took in Tokyo, and it's a very busy area with tugboats and maybe a fuel carrier. What you don't see, which is maybe more invisible, is that there is a chemical storage tank right here in the middle of the city and in the middle of the bridges. And of course, we have the boats that in the case of a large earthquake and tsunami or high storm surge, the experiences, for example, from the typhoon in 2018 show that these boats represent a hazard to the infrastructure that is around, and if it's a chemical storage tank, then we can have some problems. Now, this is not only a problem that has occurred in Japan. Hurricane Katrina and Rita caused a lot of damage in the United States. These images are from oil floating platforms that lost their mooring and were moved by the very strong storm surge into coastal areas, and in the second photo, in this photo, into one of the bridges in New Orleans that was brought up the Mississippi River. Of course, the Great East Japan earthquake also showed the dangers of having oil spills in highly populated and urbanized areas when oil is trapped in floating debris, which can become a floating fire. Also, Professor Aoki discussed about this. So we know that Naticks can happen and they represent a risk. So I think I don't have to again explain, but Natick basically comes from the acronym natural and technological. Okay, in the work that we're doing, we are referring to natural hazard triggered technological accidents, which involve the loss of containment. That means that chemicals lose their containment, they get out of their containment, and we have a chemical accident. So that is a Natick. One of the first very important Natick events occurred in 1999 following the Kocaeli earthquake in Turkey. And I'll tell you a little bit about what happened there. Also flooding, We saw also that in the Texas ice storm 2 months ago, there were also many chemical releases. So very quickly, what is the difference between chemical and Natick accidents? So in terms of the mechanism, we have that when a chemical accident occurs, usually we are planning for single events. And most of the process hazard assessment and the risk assessment that is normally done is carried out to identify hazards that are inherent to the systems. That means that are problems that can occur within an industrial plant. And then, of course, these can result because of system failures, human error, process upsets, etc. And the measures are taken to prevent the event chain from starting. And if the event chain does start, we install mitigation measures or emergency response measures. However, when you have a natural hazard, the situation is a little bit different. First, because as I will discuss later, there are currently very few, let's say, countries around the world that have regulations that require the companies to specifically consider the natural hazard, not only in the design and construction of the infrastructure, but also in the process safety analysis, okay? And so what happens is that you can have multiple and simultaneous events, but the mitigation and emergency response measures that are set up can also fail. So then you can have a situation of a Natick disaster, which may pose tremendous risk to regions that are not prepared for these types of events. So the next question is, what is the incidence of Naticks, and why should we, that means why should we worry about it, okay, and what are the consequences? So in these two figures, let me close this for a second. Okay, in these two figures, in the figure on the left-hand side, I'm showing the number of chemical accidents reported between 1990 and 2017 to the National Response Center database in the United States. Now, the number of all accidents is shown on the right side of this figure, and the number of Naticks derived or extracted from the same database are shown on the left side. As you can see, the total number of events is very large. Between 25,000 and about 35,000 events per year are reported in the US. These are any kind of chemical accidents caused by human error or by natural disasters. When we look at the events that were caused by natural disasters, these are the blue points, we see that there is a increasing trend, okay? When we further analyze the events that were caused by natural disasters, we find that the majority of those events are caused by hydrometeorological events in the US, particularly hurricanes and tropical storms are the major cause of Naticks. We carried out a special temporal analysis of the Naticks events in the US and confirmed an increasing trend in the incidence of Natick events. We also found that this increasing trend may be related to climate change. So what are the characteristics of Natick? So when I show you, this is a simulation of Hurricane Katrina based on perceptible water vapor data from the US. And we have plotted all of the Natick accidents that were triggered by Katrina based on their date, the date that they were reported they occurred, okay, and the location. And as you can see, one natural hazard can trigger hundreds of chemical accidents, as Hurricane Katrina, as this image shows. Why does this happen? Generally because of natural hazards, particularly when they're large events, can impact large areas. And so you may have common cause failures, which result in multiple and simultaneous hazardous materials releases. This, of course, the combination of the damage to many industrial facilities and systems, and the fact that during major natural disasters, you have problems also with power outages, flooding, particularly during Hurricane Katrina, it was a big problem. Then you have prolonged shutdown periods, extensive losses through ripple effects and interconnected systems. And Natick accidents tend to be an important cause of off-site impacts, okay? Ishimaru sensei talked about the regulations being regulations that are looking at impacts to workers and impacts to the population. And so Naticks tend to result in impacts off-site, so outside of the facility. As I mentioned before, this also affects emergency response capacity, as well as the containment and cleanup, which may be a challenge because of the ongoing natural hazard. So what we see is in many of our cities today, and in particular in Japan, because of the limited space, we have a dense agglomeration of residential areas and industry very close together. And this, these areas located in regions that are susceptible to natural hazards become the perfect formula for Natick events to happen. And the examples from the Great East Japan earthquake and from many other disasters from around the world are already telling us that the disasters can happen. And so I will argue with the next examples that we need to move from industrial risk management that is based on the analysis of individual facilities, okay, to a more comprehensive area-wide risk management that requires risk governance. Because there are the interests not only of individual facilities, but of other businesses and facilities, of infrastructure, and of citizens at risk or at stake. Furthermore, I argue that we need risk and hazard information disclosure and risk communication in order for these institutions or stakeholders to be better prepared. And I think also Professor Aoki and Professor Ishimaru have made reference to the need for risk communication. So let's look at where we stand currently. I think also Professor Aoki and Ishimaru sensei have discussed a lot of the problems, the current regulations. So I think some of the important things are that while the natural hazards are considered in the design of structures, they are generally not factored in process safety. Okay, this is changing. So the Seveso 3 directive, which Ishimaru sensei mentioned, has now explicit requirements to consider external hazards. And some of the countries like Germany has adopted regulations for flood trigger Natick, and France requires analysis of flood and earthquake. In Japan, the new resilience, what is it? Societal resilience law, I don't know the translation, now also requires that at least petroleum complexes remain in operation even after a large earthquake and tsunami. However, we don't know up to what point the considerations of external hazards are being factored in when companies are doing process safety analysis. And if that is not done correctly, then we have inadequate assumptions concerning safety and mitigation. Furthermore, another problem is that because Natick risk management is relatively new, there are still no agreed upon risk assessment methodologies. There are proposals already for earthquake, for assessing earthquake related Natick, for flood related Natick, for lightning, but there are no agreed methodologies and no agreed assumptions to the type of scenarios that should be considered. Another problem concerns gaps between the different stakeholders that are involved in the design, construction, operation of industrial plants. And so this often results also in problems with leading to accidents because the different factors that might play in during a natural hazard are not considered. There are also large gaps between government agencies and organizations and disciplines. One example is Ishimaru Sensei mentioned the OSHA in the United States, which is in charge of worker safety. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, is in charge of chemical accident risk. But FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency under the Department of Homeland Security, actually oversees the implementation of regulations and, of course, will respond to accidents. And so these three agencies often are not communicating, and they have, FEMA is more in charge of natural hazards, but they have not much to do with chemical accidents and so on. So this results in gaps in communication and often results in gaps in the implementation of regulations or the understanding of what has to be done. This also means that it may be overlooked in emergency planning and offsite planning for communities. And this is particularly the case in Japan, as I will discuss later, which results in community that is not well informed or not informed at all, which is generally the case in Japan, and therefore not prepared. So there is very little information being given to communities on how to prepare for or respond in the case of chemical accidents. This in part also has to do with what I mentioned before, the gap between organizations and government and different stakeholders, which means that there is generally low awareness among government officials, decision makers, industrial owners or operators regarding the need to address Natick as a special case. That means a lot of the people working in industry feel we're doing everything, we're following all the rules, we're safe. But if they haven't really considered the natural hazard, or if they don't really understand natural hazard information, they may not be well prepared or understand the kinds of scenarios that might occur. So learning from past Natick events. So as I mentioned at the beginning, so the Kojeli earthquake in 1999 was a warning, particularly for researchers in the United States, okay? The US, especially the state of California, had experienced several earthquakes, the Loma Prieta earthquake and the Northridge earthquake in 1994, where there had been some hazardous material releases but none of them were large enough to affect people outside of the facilities. And so it was still thought that it wasn't such a big problem. The Kojeli earthquake triggered 21 chemical releases that had impacts on the population. So that was really large. And in at least 2 of the cases, one was a toothbrush refinery fire in Kojeli, and the other one was a release of acrylonitrile in Yalova, in the southern part of the Marmara Sea, which required evacuation of residents. And that evacuation also meant that residents, family members, and even rescue teams had to be evacuated as well, and people had to leave, people still trapped in buildings because of the danger of the toxic release. So these are some of the problems that were identified during the Kojeli earthquake. Another interesting point from the Kojeli earthquake is about 50% of all the chemical, let's say major chemical releases, did not occur due to the earthquake itself, but due to failure of power or lack of water. And so it was more caused because of upset to the systems, not because of failure of the infrastructure. Of course, as we know, the Fukushima nuclear accident was also in part a failure of a combination of things, but in part the failure of backup systems because they were flooded. So Hurricane Katrina and Rita in 2005 also caused a huge number of chemical releases, as I showed in the previous simulation of the arrival of Hurricane Katrina. More than 400 chemical releases from fixed facilities, about 400 chemical releases from offshore platforms and pipelines were reported during Katrina. A lot of the offshore releases, and this image shows the offshore releases, were associated with the high storm surge. Now, as I mentioned, there were many chemical releases during Katrina, and one of the most important occurred at the Murphy Oil Refinery in Chalmette, Louisiana. So also very close to, part of the New Orleans metropolitan area. This oil spill affected 70,000 homes. The high storm surge moved the oil and spread the oil in a very large area. And at least 1,800 families took up a class action settlement, class action suit against the company for $330 million. A lot of the residences were later had to be demolished and couldn't be recovered. Now, I think Ishimaru Sensei mentioned some of the events that occurred in Japan in 2018, 2019, and even this past year in 2020, we had some Natics that occurred from facilities that are not, basically do not fall under any particular strict regulation concerning chemical accidents. And one of them was the aluminum explosion due to floods in Soja City in Saga Prefecture and Shimobara town, which required the evacuation of residents. So this is, I guess, since we don't have a lot of time, I'll just maybe quickly go through the timeline. But we had from July 5th, there was heavy flooding and the first flood warnings. On July 6th, there was flooding on a river next to the the aluminum recycling plant, which actually there was a river and a small canal, and on the other side there was the residential areas. Now, the plant was flooded by water from the canal before the actual residential area was flooded. Now, this was actually fortunate because the residents had gathered that day when the first flood warning was issued, and had decided that they would evacuate vertically. So people were recommended to go to the higher stories of their homes, or to move into homes that had a second level. But the accident occurred around, I don't remember the time, maybe around 11. And the residents were then decided to quickly evacuate because of the danger of other explosions. In this particular case, the factory workers knew of the danger of the explosion, and they began to take measures around 10 or earlier in the evening. And around 10:30, they evacuated the facility, but they did not inform authorities, or they did not inform the population. And then, of course, there was the explosion. There were some injuries. Fortunately, there were no deaths reported. In terms of risk management, the facility had taken some prevention measures. As I said, they tried to move the aluminum, but of course it's molten aluminum, so that was difficult. And they evacuated, but they did not report. Lack of knowledge among city officials, fire department, and citizens. We carried out some interviews. I think Hokuo Sensei is also joining this meeting. So Hokuo Sensei has also participated. And we found that city officials and even the fire department did not know that this plant represented any hazard. The good practices of the Jishu Bosai Soshiki in the area helped prevent losses, as they were quite organized, and with the help of city officials, were able to evacuate all of the residents quickly, and even before the floodwaters entered this residential area. Okay, the next event, which occurred in 2019, in August 2019, Ishimaru Sensei also briefly mentioned, occurred in Omachi town in Saga Prefecture. This was not the first time that this company shown here in this map, on this aerial photograph on the left, they also suffered flooding, I think in 1990, and had an oil spill. They had taken some preventive measures based on the maximum water heights that they experienced at that time. However, during the flooding in 2019, it was insufficient, and water entered the, this is called the quenching tank, so where molten bolts are cooled using a type of oil for cooling. And that oil, of course, because it's lighter than water, floated out of the tanks and spilled into the region. So in the case of Omachi town, residents were, so before the flood, there was heavy rain warning and flood warning, and residents were asked to evacuate. Some residents decided to evacuate vertically, so they moved to the second story of buildings. Those residents that stayed were then trapped, surrounded by water containing oil. The search and rescue was quite difficult because of the strong oil vapors, etc. So in this case, the risk management problems included a flood that exceeded the design level of preventive measures, which means that particularly in the face of climate change, this is something that needs to be revisited. So I think design standards are, we need to revisit design standards for structures, particularly for flooding, storm surge that are affected, that could be affected by climate change. The vertical evacuation resulted in people trapped in oil-covered and flood water, and there was no expectation for prolonged situation because the whole region had designed a good system for flood protection, including they had installed pumps, which unfortunately have been also affected by the floods, and also they couldn't carry out pumping because they would have contaminated other areas because of the oil spill. Okay, and this is the last one. This is the case of Ashikita in Kumamoto, which we also visited with Hokugo Sensei this past year, which suffered an explosion of a carbon manufacturing factory due to heavy rain. In this case, evacuation was also required for the flooding, but also for the Natick event. And in this case, again, the flood exceeded the design level of preventive measures that the plant had taken. And functional failure of pumps installed by the company were also a problem. So these are some examples that show that that there is need to reevaluate our current, both the design, the design of the structures we're using for prevention in face of climate change, particularly because all these cases are related to flooding and typhoon, but also that there is, in all of the cases, there was little to no information provided to residents regarding chemical accidents, neither before, during, or after the event. So how can we better address and manage Natick risk? I think a paradigm shift for Natick risk management is needed to address Natick risk effectively. And borrowing from the principles of resilience engineering, which is defined as the intrinsic ability of a system to adjust its functioning prior to, during, or following changes and disturbances so that it can sustain required operations under both expected and unexpected conditions. Now, one point that I think Aoki Sensei and Ishimaru Sensei mentioned regarding the preparedness level, level 1 and level 2 that the Japanese government has introduced, I think in many ways it begins to address this situations where we have events that are beyond the design level and we're in an unexpected condition or unexpected situation where we're not really sure what is going to happen or how it's going to happen. So in order to promote Natick resilience in a territory, we need to understand that the scope of analysis changes. What I mean is, I mentioned before that the risk management is generally up to very recently was concentrated on each facility. And I think this is not sufficient when you're talking about Natick, because Naticks can affect large areas. So the system should be the territory, including the facility or the industrial park, neighboring industries or businesses, the interconnected infrastructure on which they depend, and surrounding residential areas. That is, in fact, the new system. And so it requires a paradigm shift because it also means that it requires not only risk management, but it requires risk governance. Furthermore, the need for flexibility in order to adapt to rapidly changing dynamic situations introduced by climate change, introduced by aging equipment, population increase or population decrease, the coronavirus, etc., I think is imperative. So considering that, we propose that for Natick resilient industries, we need to consider four aspects. One are the social technical perspectives that include both the human and organizational and the technical and equipment factors that I would say that are key in developing preventive measures for complex systems and scenarios. We also need to have transparency and dissemination of information towards community-based approaches in the management and governance of risk by encouraging trust building and participation among all stakeholders. This is important because if there is no trust, industry doesn't want to give information to the public because they fear that the public will want compensation. The public doesn't trust industry because they feel that they are not being given all the information, and so on. So there needs to be trust building. In all of this, risk governance has a central role in the pursuit of holistic Natick risk management in order to bring all the stakeholders to the table, and you have both private and public resources that need to be managed. Furthermore, the consequence analysis that considers surrounding environmental conditions and their implications for the propagation of a Natick event are very important. This is almost my final slide. So this is basically a summary of what I've said. We propose a kind of a new Natick risk management framework, which has those components. So the infrastructure component, which is of course very important, but also the organizational and management, the external environment, and the risk governance and risk communication, which ensures that the whole territory can prepare itself to minimize loss of lives, minimize property damage, and environmental impacts. So to conclude, the risk management of Natick hazards, I think, requires a new paradigm. I think we need to move towards an area-wide, that means a scope beyond individual facilities, to a comprehensive risk management framework. This requires cooperative actions for risk reduction by all stakeholders, including local government, companies, residents, infrastructure managers, law enforcement officials, many stakeholders. Natick events are likely to occur when natural hazards exceed design levels. So the need to incorporate notions of resilience engineering and systems view is very important. Efforts for risk reduction should include, of course, both hard and soft countermeasures, and I think that is already part of the level 1, level 2, let's say, framework of the national government. Knowing and sharing risk information should be the first step towards territorial resilience and risk reduction, but it's not easy. This sentence I actually borrowed from Aoki sensei, because I think it's very important. It's key to be able to move forward in having a safe and resilient territory. I want to leave some questions which I think are guiding at least my future research. I some of these things I'm already addressing, but there is no time, but I want to leave them here. So first, do Japanese people have an appetite for Natick and chemical risk information? So we're looking at this through several surveys we've already finished. And the answer is yes, there is appetite and there is need. Should Natick hazards and risk be communicated to the public and made available upon request? According to our surveys, people believe, yes, it's needed and it's urgent. Should Natick hazards or risks be assessed and mapped? We haven't checked on that yet. What are the barriers and challenges in moving towards risk information disclosure? This is an area that we're still working on. There are many reasons and many barriers for that, and probably the discussion for another session. What are the implications of all of this, the lack of information or information for emergency planning? And also, are there ethical issues to be considered? I bring this to the table because when I've looked at barriers, one of the things that come up very often is property values. And so a lot of people feel that if risk information is provided, that it will decrease their property values. And so is this an ethical issue? Should we value more the fact that property values will go down or people's lives? So anyway, that's all, and thank you very much. I just want to say that the research what I'm presenting here is not only my work, but of course of my group. And thank you very much.